Greetings, this is MBA 522. This is Decision Making in Organizations and our lecture on communication. We've already spent some time talking about communication channels and specifically the way that information or communication flows through the organization, upwards, downwards, horizontal communication. We talked about lean versus rich communication media and the tools that we can use, the channels or the tools that we use to help information flow through the company. We also introduced the idea that communication is three parts, that it is the verbs, the words that we use, it's the tone that we use, and it's our body language. And much of our communication, as you know, is nonverbal. The words only represent so much of the communication. The nonverbals, in terms of body language and tone, are much more important. And so this lecture starts to go down a little bit deeper into the interpersonal exchange between two people to figure out how we communicate, and then the importance of good communication when we're making decisions, particularly when we're making decisions and have to implement them, or we're making decisions and working with others to be able to do so. Communication style is the way in which or how we interact and exchange information with others. And each of us has a style, or we have multiple styles. We may adapt based on the person we're speaking with and sort of how to manage our communication. Generally speaking, though, it's agreed that we want to be more assertive in our communication style, not aggressive or passive aggressive for that matter. But there's a couple of different ways that we can classify communication style. I'm going to give you the two basics. One deals with passive aggressive, and assertive, and there's some variations on this that you'll see in the literature. But basically, those four categories are, sort of give you the range from sort of healthy communication to unhealthy communication, and what those look like. And the next slide also deals with communication styles that actually map very nicely to our decision-making styles. And you can see how I would expect that someone's decision-making style sort of maps, it does influence the communication style that they use, because we start to make inferences about how someone is making a decision by listening to the words that they use with respect to what data they're talking about in terms of data-driven, or are they analytical-driven, or, again, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. So let's let's get it sort of the first sort of generic strategy, if you will, for communications. And this one addresses, again, from passive to passive-aggressive, and then assertive. And all four of these represent different ways to communicate information. The ideal, of course, is the assertive, but let's talk about a passive first. Passive individuals don't express their feelings in communication. They don't even acknowledge their needs in the context of the communication. They tend to be very passive. They minimize what they need. They minimize their opinion on things, and they simply say, well, it just doesn't matter to me. They're not an active communicator. They're not an active participant oftentimes in these communications, and their goal, of course, as the passive communicator is to minimize their impact on others, and so they are unwilling to assert themselves in any way about what they think can or should be happening. In terms of aggressive communication, this is an individual that speaks in a very loud and demanding voice. I'm right and you are wrong, and they are typically dominating the conversation without any tact. They're overtaking and demanding in the communication. So again, this can overwhelm people, particularly the passive talker. If you got someone on either of those extremes, a passive communicator and an aggressive communicator, the aggressive communicator will roll right over that passive communicator and not give them an opportunity to share their points of view or to communicate clearly what their perspective is or what their needs are. The passive-aggressive communicator appears passive on the surface, but underneath they're stewing. They sort of have reached their boiling point, and of course, they find subtle ways to undermine the other individual who they may disagree with. And the challenges with the passive-aggressive communicator is that they seem like they're agreeable on the surface, but really underneath they are not willing to go along. They will be rude, they will be condescending, they will be disruptive if they can, but usually in a very subtle way to disrupt whatever is going on. And oftentimes teenagers act in passive aggressive ways. They're like, fine, I'll do what you want, and underneath their breath you'll hear them say, that's just so stupid. And so they're being passive aggressive, and that's not an uncommon developmental stage. And of course it's our job as parents to stop them from engaging in passive aggressive behavior for longer than need be. So the passive-aggressive person may seem, again, cooperative on the surface, but really in reality they're not just going along to get along. They are pretending they're going along, but they don't feel confident enough in their ability to speak up properly and assertively to address what they think needs to happen. And so they engage in this more subtly aggressive way to communicated what they want. Assertive is an individual that expresses their own needs but respects the needs of others. And so they'll say, I feel frustrated, but let's try to solve this problem. So they're not afraid to be direct in saying, we have an issue, we have a concern, but the challenge is that instead of being aggressive about it or even being passive aggressive, they are willing to work with somebody else to discuss whatever it is needs to be discussed. So oftentimes communication styles can map to decision-making styles. They can also map to conflict resolution styles. So passive communicators are less likely to engage in integrative bargaining. They're much more likely to be avoidant or accommodating, where they'll just roll over and give whatever is needed to get what they want. And aggressive communication, the individual is much more likely to aggressively demand what they want in a zero-sum way. I want what I want, and I don't care if that hurts you. And neither of those is really helpful in resolving communication conflicts, getting what you want for yourself or your organization. And so the goal is to learn how to be assertive without being aggressive. You're learning how to say, this is what I need. Here, I feel frustrated, and this is how I want to solve this problem. This other style of communication, this 2x2 matrix on this, and notice how it maps really nicely to our decision-making styles. The director, the thinker, which is our directive decision maker, our analytical decision maker, and on the right, the expressor and the harmonizer. The expressor is our conceptual decision maker, and our harmonizer is our behavioral decision maker. And you can see how these things very easily map to each other. Someone who is directive in their decision-making style is going to be a director in the way that they communicate things. They're going to tell it like it is. They're going to make decisions quickly. They are crisp. They may seem insensitive, but that's not necessarily the case. But they're very goal-directed, so they're going to get the information they need. They're going to make the decision, and they're going to move on to the next thing. Because typically they want to keep going and moving and addressing all the issues that they need to address. So the thinker, the same thing. They're making their list. They do things by the book. They're very deliberate in the way that they manage things. Your expressor is much more about thinking out loud, thinking rapidly. They do expressive gestures. They are animated. They're the idea person, the conceptual person. And your harmonizer, again, is very relationship focused. They want to, it says here, avoid conflict. I think what they're looking at is sort of managing conflict. And so harmonizers want to make sure that that there is constructive conflict, but that the constructive conflict moves forward. And if you think about the case that you had to do for Module 2, where Don had a particular decision-making style, and oftentimes he was a harmonizer, and he didn't engage in the constructive conflict that needs to happen. And so that's something to consider, that he, sort of needs to. The behavioral style is perfectly fine in general, but you also have to make sure that your conflict resolution is moving forward and you've got constructive debate as you're working through things. And then there are times when he has to step up to the plate and be more directive in his style. But you can see how that absolutely and easily maps to the decision-making styles. In terms of the impact on communication style, recognize that when we combine our style of communicating, whether we are assertive or aggressive, whether we're more directive or harmonizing, when we combine our style with verbal and nonverbal communication issues, and we are providing rich information to other people that has a lot of input, a lot of data that's being communicated. It's not just the word, it's the tone, it's the body language, it's the style that interacts with all that, that really creates this rich bunch of information that's coming to you as a communicator. But of course, with all this rich information and all that data that's being communicated, there may be a lack of clarity, particularly if your words and your style and your tone and your body language are not in alignment. And so if they're not in alignment, then there's going to be some confusion because your tone may say one thing, but your words may be saying something entirely different. Miscommunication then happens when there's a lack of clarity. So this is where active listening and echoing back information is a really big part of communication, having to make sure that what we communicate is communicated clearly. So if you're getting mixed messages, then it is important to ask back. So your tone is saying this, but your words are saying this. What should I listen to, right? Because of this miscommunication, then, if we don't ask those active questions to get clarity about what it is that's being communicated to us, we run into the likelihood of making poor decisions. Because when there's that lack of alignment between all the communication elements, this is going to create issues, and then people start to make assumptions, and then when those assumptions are made, that's when the communication falls apart. So what's really important as we think about communication style, we have to make sure that our style, our words, our tone, and our nonverbals are all in alignment and all are working well to communicate the message exactly the way that we want. So how does communication then relate to decision making? Well, communication is one of the important keys to decision making because it can lead to decision bias if we're not careful about what we're communicating, or if we're not careful about how we're listening to what someone else is communicating to us. So the relationship between the two is important. Number one, that we need to understand what is being communicated to us. So if we're being asked to make a decision, we need clarity on all the data that's being communicated, verbal, nonverbal, style, tone, all those things. We need to be able to understand what's going on. So we have to be able to assess what was been communicated to us in terms of understanding what's coming in. Then we also need to be able to communicate, when we're communicating clearly to others, issues, concerns, and facts. So if we are saying, here's the decision and here's the data that you need to consider, we need to make sure that that data is clear, that they understand the language, they understand all of those elements. And so, again, communication's a dance. I ask you a question, or I provide information to you, you ask questions or provide information back, and we're constantly working back and forth to make sure we understand what the other was talking about. If you start with making assumptions and not asking the right questions, and that's where the communication starts to fall apart. We need to be able to communicate ideas during the decision-making process. And so if we're generating ideas and trying to communicate that with either our subordinates or our peers in a group decision process, we want to make sure we're communicating these things clearly to others. And so we have to make sure the ideas are getting out there, that there's some clarity as to what those ideas are. Lastly, communication is important because if we've made a decision and we need to communicate this to others, we need to communicate what was decided and why. So again, we need more clarity on the decision process, what we did, why we thought it this way, how do we support it in a persuasive way, and then communicate what we did to others. And so, while there's 500 million things I could say about communication, these are the basics that I want you to know to take away from this idea of the impact of communication on decision making, that we have to make sure that we are clear in what we're hearing, that we are willing to ask the questions, that we're clear in asking the right questions and communicating what we think are the issues and concerns and facts to others. We need to make sure we're very clear in how we're communicating during the decision process. And then lastly, clearly communicating what we decided and why.